So back in April, I had the honor of trying to moderate a discussion about David Block's book, Baseball Before We Knew It, both the 2005 edition and the 2025 edition. And I was reading it, and as I was reading it, I was, getting a little bit lost in the sauce. And I was kind of said to myself, the person that could speak best about this is really David. So I called him up and asked him, how would you like to do a special event, in July sometime? And, kind of like talk about your book. It's something we normally don't do, is have authors talk about their books. But this book is particularly, well, both books actually, are particularly valuable to us all as baseball history researchers, because it really is, as John Thorne said in his introduction, about how important the book was in terms of laying the groundwork for future baseball research. So with that in mind, I asked David if he would be kind enough to do this, and he agreed. And without further ado, I want to introduce David Block.
Thank you, Peter. Does everybody hear me?
Yes.
I can't hear. Do you hear me, Peter?
Sounds good for me.
So coming through clear, yes.
Is that a yes, that everybody hears me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm not really comfortable with Zoom. I've never done something like this on Zoom before, so I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to respond to individual people who have questions. So hopefully it'll work itself out without me having to do any particular intervention that I don't know how to do. With that said, I'm going to launch into my talk, and my idea is to keep this pretty informal, and I'm going to open with a few remarks just for a few minutes, and then my objective is to throw it open to questions or comments from those of you participating, and we'll take it from there. So I don't know really to what degree various ones of you are familiar with my work, are familiar with the topic of baseball's origins. So I'm going to just say a little bit about how I got into this myself, and then say a little bit about what are baseball's origins in about 2 minutes. I started as a collector. Initially, I collected baseball photos from the 19th century, prints from the 19th century, and then started collecting early books that had something in them about baseball or about predecessor games about baseball. And the existing baseball bibliographies didn't cover the books from like 1860 and earlier, which were the types of titles that I was collecting. So I started working on a bibliography, and as part of that project, I thought I'd have an introduction that said something about how baseball started. And this was back in the year 2000, 2001, in that period. And at that time, I obviously knew it wasn't after Doubleday, but I didn't really know what current scholarship had to say on the subject of baseball's origins. I went off and looked at the standard histories that existed and looked at their opening chapters and saw that there really wasn't much there. Most authors kind of skipped over the origins or just repeated anecdotal stories, but there wasn't any original research in virtually any of them. So that kind of piqued my curiosity. And one of the things that was repeated most commonly in those histories was that baseball came from the game of rounders, the English game. And obviously rounders and baseball are similar in a number of characteristics. But I decided to see what I could find about the origins of rounders. And my research showed that rounders really wasn't very old. The earliest references to it didn't date any earlier than the 1820s. But I knew just from my cursory research that references to baseball went back earlier than that, went back to the 18th century. So this story kind of drew me into it, and I started doing some additional research. I made a pretty cool big discovery in the summer of 2001 when I found this German book that had a 7-page description of baseball. This book dated from 1796. And as far as I knew, these were the earliest rules or description of baseball, and they were in German. But the author of the German book didn't claim that the game was actually played in Germany. He referred to it as English baseball. And English baseball, as I subsequently learned, was a pretty widely played game in England, beginning in the early 18th century, and continued to be played for almost 200 years, but totally under the radar. It was a folk game. It was never organized, never had clubs or leagues or anything like that. The whole idea of it existing and nobody remembering about it, or really nobody ever having done any research into it, just drew me into the whole subject of origins. So how did baseball originate? That is something that has not been fully answered. Its history, its early history is still pretty murky. I've dug into it a lot. I've spent better part of the last 25 years digging into it, and I've learned some things. But still, we don't know exactly where, when, or how baseball originated. It had roots going back centuries in various folk games in England, as well as many other societies. Hitting a ball with a bat is kind of an intuitive form of play, and there are versions of bat and ball games in many societies and many cultures going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. But most immediately, I believe, American baseball descended from English baseball. I believe English baseball was American baseball's direct forerunner. And my research suggests that this English baseball began somewhere in the southeast of England, sometime in the early 18th century, if not the late 17th. And I believe it was started by curious and adventurous English youngsters experimenting with ball games, drawing elements from some of the multiple forms of ball games that had been played in England going back centuries, drawing characteristics from them and forming a new game, which they called baseball. And I can't prove that that's how it happened, but that seems a logical assumption based on what evidence we do have. And there is evidence from the 18th century. Notably, there are 6 pieces of evidence from the 1740s, 1750s, and 1760s. These are from different media. There was a newspaper article, there was a children's book, there was a letter, there was a diary, and there was a novel, there was a dictionary. And what they have in common is that they all mention baseball. And what I draw from these 6 different pieces of evidence is that the game was not newly born in the 1740s, because it seems to have already been established by then, if I interpret the evidence correctly. It also was a game that was played by both children and adults. It was played by both men and women. And it continued. It continued to be played under the radar, as I said, in southern England throughout the rest of the 18th century, through the entirety of the 19th century, and into the beginning of the 20th century. And my fascination with the fact that this game was so wildly popular in parts of England for so long, that kind of prompted me to write my second book, Pastime Lost, which is solely focused on English baseball. But going back, English baseball was established. It had characteristics that were similar to American baseball, but not exactly the same. It appears that originally the ball was hit with the palm of a hand instead of with a bat. But in other ways, there was a server who pitched the ball to an awaiting striker who hit the ball, who then proceeded to run around a circuit of bases and return home if possible. And the other team tried to catch the ball on a fly, or if not successful at doing that, to retrieve the ball and try to retire a base runner when they're not on a base. So those basic characteristics carried forward into American baseball. I do not know how English baseball got to North America. There is no evidence that shows that some particular kid or some particular family brought it over with them. It probably happened on multiple occasions because it was a folk game, it was popular in England. People from England migrated to North America in the colonial era and after. And it seems highly probable that one or more of those immigrants brought the game with them, just as they brought other aspects of English folk culture with them, like nursery rhymes and other things. So the presumption is that English baseball was the direct ancestor of American baseball, because even though that's just circumstantial evidence, what else could it be? I mean, the two games resembled each other. The two games had the name baseball, and there is no counter argument. I mean, did two games called baseball with similar characteristics just arise on two continents completely independent of each other? That seems pretty unlikely. That the game originated in North America and then traveled to England, that seems pretty preposterous. And it was not derived from Native Americans, for example, even though the Native Americans played many ball games and were very skilled ball players. There's no evidence that any of their many games played throughout the Americas resembled baseball. So I'm highly confident in saying that baseball's immediate ancestor was English baseball. But saying that, I believe that American baseball, North American baseball, set off on its own evolutionary path pretty early on. It seems pretty likely from the evidence that Tom Arthur and other researchers, John Thorne and myself, researching into early American baseball, it seems likely that baseball was being played in North America probably in the colonial era, if not immediately afterwards. And at that point, baseball in North America began its own evolutionary path. I don't believe that it was influenced by English baseball after the 18th century. I think by then it had already been pretty set in North America and was developing here in multiple ways. It seems like it was implanted both in New England and in the Middle Atlantic states, especially New York City and the New York City area. And the game had distinct characteristics in both of those two regions that were not hammered out and unified until the mid-19th century. And it was played pretty widely, I believe, by the turn of the 19th century. there's an increasing body of evidence from, around the year 1800 to the year 1835, when organized clubs started being formed in North America, that in that first 35-year period of the 19th century, that it was being played pretty widely. There are many children's books, chapbooks, that have illustrations of kids playing bat and ball, looking very baseball-like in how they're approaching the game. There's newspaper articles, just lots of references to base or baseball in those decades. So it was pretty well established here. And of course, there was no commonality in how it was played. Every community probably played by its own rules. There was no, standard codified rules to guide how people played. Every locale played it a little differently, and it was called different names. It was called baseball, it was called base, it was sometimes called baseball spelled B-A-S-S, B-A-L-L. It was called town ball. It was called round ball in New England. And the fact that it was called town ball or round ball did not necessarily mean it was played in the same way as a neighboring community or a neighboring state that called it town ball. There was no consistency at all, as far as we know from the evidence. So that is, in a nutshell, is my lecture on how baseball began. And I am now going to invite questions and comments from any of you participating, and I'd be happy to answer anything you throw my way if I can. And I don't know how to host this particular part of things, so if somebody can help me out here, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, well, David, there's a chat feature on Zoom where people can type in questions, but there's also just me asking you questions, just like we're talking about right now.
Okay.
Your book is fascinating. I got a million observations, questions, whatever, but I'll start out with one. How did Goodsmith, that German guy in a very small German principality, what is your observations or thought is how he learned about English baseball? Seeing as how, as far as you are concerned, as far as I'm concerned, there was no printed rules in the English language for him to consult. So how did he learn about it?
Well, that's a good question, and it's one that bedeviled me for a long, long time. And I did a lot of research into this author, Gutsmuth's. I determined that he never traveled outside of the small duchy in central Germany where he lived and worked. There's no evidence of correspondence between him and people in England, but he taught at this progressive school, a new school that had just been founded a decade or so before he wrote the book. It's called the Salzman School. And Gutsmuth was a pioneer in the field of physical education. And he, at some point in the early 1790s, an English student came to the school, and his name escapes me. I have my book, Pastime Lost, here. I could look it up, but I don't know if that's important. But he not only came to the school, but he became very close to this German author and his family. He lived with this German author and his family, and they were this teacher, the author, was very, very fond of this young man. And I have letters from him that I obtained from his papers from Germany, that he was very heartbroken when this young man left to go back to England. And he talked about how this young man helped him learn English. So even though it's speculation, it seems highly likely that Gutsmuth learned about English baseball and cricket from this student that was with him for several years in the early 1790s.
Well, that makes sense. A passing of an oral tradition, maybe rather than something printed. But the student
Yeah.
had to be very familiar with the game, obviously, to be able to give this kind of detailed rulemaking.
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah.
So can everybody hear me? I'm just jumping on. This is Jonathan, and Jacob asked me to kind of take over some of the duties here. So I'm going to try to get to some of the questions that I see with hands up.
Great.
Craig.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, no problem, David. Craig, I see Karen, Craig, and Ian have some questions. Let me just start with Craig, and then we'll move on to Karen. Craig, go ahead. Question for David?
I'm wondering how far back, looking at newspapers, have you ever come across a newspaper where the author of the article felt compelled to define what baseball is? Because I've seen a lot of 19th century articles about baseball, and they just say baseball. There's never a thing where somebody says baseball, a game played with a bat and ball and 4 bases. It just seems like the author assumes you know what baseball is in writing about baseball. So have you ever come across a
Not to my
18th century
knowledge,
article?
not an early one that I can recall. That is a very good point. And it kind of underscores the fact that the game was really well established, that people knew what it was, and the author assumed that the audience knew what baseball was when they addressed it in one way or another.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Karen. Karen, you're on mute, Karen. You have to unmute yourself, and there you go.
Okay. I was wondering about stickball, because I had read that Willie Mays liked to play stickball. And I was wondering,
Well, stickball is one of an infinite number of, I would call them folk games or informal forms of baseball that evolved over the years, the decades, the century, really. Baseball as an organized sport was played on fields with 9 men on the side and all the other rules, but if you're just playing in a schoolyard or in a playground with your friends or on a city street, you have to make adaptations if you want to play something resembling baseball. And stickball was just one that it was best known, I suppose, in New York City. It was played elsewhere, I'm sure. And there were dozens and dozens. And the Protoball website actually has lists of some of these many variants that were played.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
David, the hands are going up hot and heavy, so I'm going to try to get to them in the order that I saw them appear. So Ian, go ahead and give us what you got.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks very much, David, for taking us through your research. Really interesting. I have not read your book yet, but I will definitely have to. And I don't know if you came across much of this in your research, but I'm kind of interested in like baseball in Reconstruction era Southern United States and how it evolved differently. And, it was, at least to my understanding, always sort of a northern kind of dominated game. But obviously there were great early baseball stars from the South. So I don't know if you came across the role of early baseball in the South during that era at all.
And my answer is that I am not a specialist in anything that's post-Civil War. And there are other people on this call who could probably answer that question much better than I can. My research pretty much was, from the amateur era, earlier, before the professional era, and mostly before 1845.
Gotcha.
So sorry to duck this one, but
No worries.
Maybe we
Yeah,
can
thank you.
maybe we can go ahead and swing back around to that one if we have the time. I'm just gonna. So the next hand I think I saw go up in order. We're gonna go Dixie, David, Bruce, then Bill. So Dixie, go ahead.
Okay, I have Dave Newman. Well, frozen up here.
Okay, I got it now. David, the book is great. It's always been great. It's hard to read, yes. Had to read every sentence twice, yes. But it's a great book, nonetheless. I have 2 questions unrelated. The first one is, how many of you are out there looking for these books about games being played in the 18th, 17th century for you to try and find them somewhere? I mean, they're there can't be a lot of books out there for you to find to read. So how does that work?
They're hard to find. What can I tell you? I have been looking for books in that category for decades. I do have a nice collection myself. There's others that I wish I had, but haven't been able to find yet or haven't been able to afford. But you really have to, do the research. So my first edition of Baseball Before You Knew It, I had a bibliography in there. Those were books that I knew about at the time, or from my own research or from the research of others. And subsequent to that, in the 20 years since that book came out and my new edition came out this year, I've augmented the bibliography. I've added a lot of new books that I have found in the intervening time. But I don't know how many more books are out there to be discovered that actually mention baseball. But I'm always on the hunt. If you find one, let me know.
My second question is about this book, which I found in my bookcase about a week ago. I didn't realize that I had a first edition of it. That's 1947, the year I was born. So my question is, does this book still have a status in this genre?
Absolutely. The answer is absolutely. That book, or Robert W. Henderson's research, influenced me greatly. In some ways, if I'm not being too immodest, I would consider myself somewhat of a successor to him, because he was really the first person to really try to, using scholarly methodology, dig into, try to find the origins of baseball. And considering that he was working in an era without any digital assistance, he just had to, use library books, and, travel wasn't easy in those days. He had a job, and what he was able to learn was kind of amazing. His first two essays that appeared in the late 1930s in the bulletin of the New York Public Library were really eye-openers. I mean, he gets credit not for being the first person to debunk the Doubleday myth, but for the first person to really attempt to popularize the fact that Doubleday was not the inventor. And he used evidence to, throw cold water on the whole Doubleday story. So yes, he accomplished a lot with his work, and he's been misinterpreted. If I would just might go on a little tangent and talk about that. A lot of the people who cited Rounders as being the immediate ancestor of baseball cited Henderson. But what Henderson actually wrote was not that baseball came from Rounders. It was more of a syntactical thing with him. He acknowledged that there was the earlier game called baseball, and he believed that when Rounders came along in the 19th century, it was simply the same game as Rounders. It was just simply, same game as English baseball. It was just a new name. And that's what I thought initially as well. But my continuing research showed, to my satisfaction, that baseball, English baseball, and Rounders were two distinct games. So Henderson was wrong on that point. But when he said that baseball came from Rounders, he simply was referring to the fact that there was an 1828 description of Rounders in an English children's book. And that description was then copied and cloned and modified slightly and appeared in a couple of American books under the name baseball. So he was pointing out that American baseball came from Rounders only in the fact that this, short description of baseball from the 1830s had first seen life as a description of Rounders in the 1820s. But it didn't mean that he thought that Rounders was the true ancestor of baseball. I'm sorry, this was a little wonky, but
That's okay.
No,
clear it up.
that's good stuff, David. Thank you. Next hand, David Newman, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could tease us with a couple of additions or discoveries that are in your new edition of the book.
Discoveries that are in the edition of the book or in the bibliography, which did you?
Oh, in the book itself, is there something that?
There isn't a lot, but there is one thing that I think is really cool. I should have had a printout here to show, but in 1823, and this is something I just discovered last summer, and I've mentioned it to some of you already, but in 1823, a short little article appeared in the annual report of a school in Hartford, Connecticut. It was the School for the Deaf. At the time, it was called the Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb, but it is School for the Deaf, which still exists today as the American School of the Deaf in Hartford. It's a very important and long-established institution. And in this 1823 little report, it doesn't mention the word baseball, but it's like an essay, and it's called On Playing Ball, is the title of the essay.
Mhm.
And the author of that short piece goes on to describe how baseball is played. And it's a little crude, it's a little lacking in detail, but it's recognizable as an early form of proto-baseball, like the type that was played in many communities around that time. And I can make that available, but the interesting thing about it, well, to me, the most interesting thing about it is the fact that it starts out by describing how sides are chosen and how it's determined which team bats first. And the method they use is that one player, the captain of one team, although didn't use the word captain, used the term overseer. The overseer of one team would toss a bat to the overseer of the other team. And then they would proceed to put one hand on top of the other up to the top of the bat. Now, those of you of a certain age who played baseball on schoolyards and playgrounds when you were kids will remember that that's how we used to make those same decisions, how we would decide who would pick first in assembling a team or who would go first in the batting. So I found it fascinating that this schoolyard method of decision making from when I was a kid was played 200 years ago.
Bruce.
Oh, thank you. Well, first of all, Ian, you asked about baseball in the South in the Reconstruction era. I wrote the article on that about 12 years ago. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to comment and contact me about that.
Thanks,
But
Bruce.
but for David, I'm a golf historian, as I think you know, and one of the evidences of golf in the colonies that golf historians have discovered was the ship manifests showing importation of golf balls and golf equipment to the colonies. Now, is there and have you investigated something similar for baseball that they would have shipped at the very least balls or cricket balls to the colonies? And could that be a possible evidence of the connection between the English and the American game?
And the answer is no, I have not found anything like that. And I would doubt if such a thing actually happened because English baseball was, as I said, just was a folk game. I don't believe that there were any companies manufacturing balls for English baseball. I suspect it was just all homemade, just like many balls were in early United States. I think it was just a homemade thing. You'd get some yarn, you'd get piece of rubber, you'd get some leather, and your mom would sew it up. And I think it's very unlikely we will find evidence of that.
Is there a possibility that the early baseball players in America used cricket balls, or that were obviously brought over?
Possibly, but cricket balls were pretty hard, and early forms of American baseball used soaking pretty much as a standard practice. So until the clubs, started playing in the 1830s, I would very much doubt they would have used cricket balls prior to that. Now, maybe they did, especially Massachusetts, maybe they did. Once they started playing more serious forms of adult baseball in the 1840s, 1850s, they may have used cricket balls, but otherwise I would have no idea.
Bill Lumber.
Well, I'll start with an observation. I visited with David in San Francisco over 20 years ago, and I was struck by how few books he had on baseball in the 1800s, because it just seemed like it was way too recent, for him to be concerned with. So he had a wonderful collection of material. David, we talk about soaking being one of the differences between these games, but it seems that the other one that doesn't get as much attention and is not always described as such is the fact that these games seem to have been 360-degree playing fields. Is that your observation as well? And that maybe the true New York innovation was the move towards the 90-degree territory?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that was a major innovation of the New York game. The only predecessor that I've ever been able to discover to something that resembles foul lines is just in the game of trap ball, where you had to hit the ball within a certain boundary that was marked by lines like that. But as far as any kind of baseball-like activity, yeah, it was, there was no evidence of foul lines before the New York game. Now, I suppose, based on contours of playing areas and other, limitations as far as the number of players involved, informally, it's quite possible that some of these early proto baseball games had, if not foul lines exactly, at least restrictions on where the ball could be hit. But certainly was a major innovation of the New York game.
Thanks.
We have a question also in the chat that I'll go ahead and read out here. It's from Barry Gray, and his question to you, David, is: it sounds like you started as a bibliographer, not necessarily a historian. How did you get interested in bibliography? And he's asking himself as a retired librarian.
Well, as I said, I started as a collector. And it frustrated me that the existing baseball bibliographies kind of just started at a time that was later than the era of books that I was collecting. So well, the truth is I had taken an early retirement, and this was in the fall of the year 2000. And I was having a little hard time adjusting to having, all my time to myself now instead of going to work. And I was rattling around in the house, and my wife would come home from her difficult job as a classroom teacher, and I would complain to her about how unproductive I had been that day. And she was getting kind of fed up with that, and she was threatening to send me back to work if I didn't come up with a suitable project. So creating a bibliography of the books I was collecting, or the type of book I was collecting, seemed like a suitable project. So I dove into that. I actually partnered for a while with a fellow named Barry Sloat, who had written an article on collectible baseball books. We started out on the bibliography project as a joint project, but it became pretty obvious early on that I had more ambitious ideas with the project that he did, and we mutually parted ways. So I carried on with the project myself. And as I said, it was a bibliography, and it continued to be a bibliography until I started working on that introduction. And I was drawn into the history just because it seemed very peculiar to me that of all the thousands and thousands of books that have been written about baseball's origins, almost none of them, Henderson being an exception, really, concentrated on the aspect of origins. Well, there was another book also by, and I'm having a little bit of a, I don't want to say senior moment, but I can't remember the name of the book, but the Man Who Invented Baseball is the title. And that was a book that advocated Alexander Cartwright being the inventor of baseball, which obviously was off base. But that same author spent a lot of time talking about origins. But other than those two examples, nobody really had gone into the topic before. So I was kind of had a wide open field for research into origins at that time. Since then, other people have gotten involved in origins, and I'm very grateful for that, but it's not a large field. In any case, the bibliography seemed like a segue. It did become a segue into my study of origins.
I see Caesar has his hand up. Caesar, go ahead and ask your question.
David, first of all, thanks so much for sharing your time with us. And as a researcher, there is always a discovery that sends chills down your spine. You know, when you find something that made you think, hey, I might get something big here. What was what was that discovery in your case that makes you, I mean, make your body, you know what I mean, made your body boil with enthusiasm. I think we all have that feeling at one
Yes,
time.
David, what's been your eureka moment?
Well, my eureka moment was that German book I mentioned earlier, the German book from 1796, because it was toward the end of the summer of the year 2001. I mentioned that book about man who invented baseball. The author's name was Peterson. I remember it now. And in that book, he talked about a game called the German ball game that he said was an ancestor of baseball. And he mentioned that he found this reference to the German ball game in a German book and by this author Gutsmuths. And as a collector and reading that this was a book about games and sports that was published in Germany in 1796, I was immediately excited about trying to get a copy. So I found a bookseller in Germany who had a copy, and I requested it, and it came. But it came the day before my family and I were due to leave for a family vacation in Alaska. I opened the book because I was very excited to have it, and I thumbed through the table of contents. Of course, it was in German, and my finger went down and I saw Das Deutsche Ballspiel, the German ball game, was there. But then my eyes drifted to the entry right below, and it said, Ball mit Freistatten oder das Englische Baseball. It had the word baseball. And eyes bulged out of my head. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But of course, I couldn't read the text because it was in German. Not only was it German, it was an older form of German that no longer many people really can understand very well today. In any case, I photocopied those pages, the 7 pages of description of baseball from 1796, and brought them with us on our trip to Alaska. And on one ferry ride there, I heard some German tourists talking among themselves. And my wife was telling me, Barbara said, go show them the photocopies. Maybe they can tell you what it says. And I was pretty shy. I didn't want to do it, but she urged me to do it. I did do it. And they were very agreeable. They looked at them. They were passing the pages from one to another, nodding their heads, talking to each other. And they gave them back to me and said, we really can't figure this out. This form of German is pretty obscure now. It's a little hard for us to understand it. In any case, I got back to San Francisco and I found a graduate student at UC Berkeley who studied, German literature from that era. And she translated it for me. And that obviously from what she found was that it was something that was recognizable as baseball. It was different in some ways. The terminology was different, but it was recognizable as baseball. So that was my eureka moment, because at that point on, there was no turning back. I was going to dig into this topic as far as I could get.
All right. And back to Dixie.
Yeah, David, on the subject of book collecting precisely, could you give us an example of some time where you saw a book, ran across one by accident or whatever, and you really wanted to maybe get this book because it had information that you sought, but either the price was too much or getting it was too hard to do? Could you give us a story about one of those episodes?
Oh, boy. Have to think about this for a second. Pretty much, when I discover a book, either, I don't generally just come across a book that, for one reason or another, I can't obtain, that I haven't heard about already. So, for example, I did find a book at a book fair some years ago in London. It was a tiny little Scottish dictionary from the year 1818. And I just picked it up, and anytime I see an old dictionary, I always pick it up to see if there's anything about baseball. And in this case, I looked at the letter B, and it's just a tiny little book, and Scottish English dictionary. And the first entry was for the word baw, B-A-W, also B-A apostrophe, and it's a ball. And then the next entry was baw bases, B-A-I-S-E-S, baw bases, and bases is bases, and it was ball bases. And it said a particular game at ball. That was the definition. My subsequent research into Scottish games that were baseball-like found a number of them, and they all had some version of bases in their name. Bessie Ball, Beezy, Bazies. There was half a dozen different games played in Scotland, in different areas of Scotland, that had some form of bases in their name. And so I bought that book on the spot because it was pretty cheap. But other books that I can't afford, or I should say, don't feel comfortable spending the money on, like Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. You can get a copy any day of the week by going online and spending $12,000, $15,000, $20,000 for a first edition. I don't feel like I need to add that to my collection because it's not a true rarity. I do have in my collection 5 books from the 18th century that mention baseball, which I'm pretty thrilled about having those. Some are relatively easy to find, others not at all. But as far as just coming across one that I would love to have but can't afford, there's so few of them that I can't think of anything that falls into that category.
Well, after this, if everyone wants to hang around, we'll start a support group for collectors for stories of the things we can't afford. I will be I'll start. Matt, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. David, to say that your work has been monumental in updating our understanding of the early game and its origins would be an understatement. But you've mentioned in your books and in the talk today about predecessors who have touched on several points that you've made quite clear in your research as well. We now know that Abner Doubleday didn't create baseball. We know that it wasn't Alexander Cartwright. We know these things as fact today. You can even look it up on Wikipedia and it's not wrong. And I attribute a lot of that to you. Why do you think your research might have been so successful in changing that understanding, whereas the predecessors were not as successful?
Well, I think there was Henderson, when he first published his findings that the Doubleday story was bunk, it was right on the eve of World War II. and it was also right on the eve of the Hall of Fame opening in Cooperstown in 1839. There was a lot of attention being played in the media and elsewhere about the 100th anniversary of baseball because he invented it in 1839. So in 1939 was the centennial. And there was a stamp issued by the post office. There was going to be a big parade. There was all kinds of attention being placed on the opening of the Hall of Fame and the centennial of baseball. And Henderson got some press. There are a number of articles in the New York press after his findings were published. But he was going up against a pretty powerful institution, and Major League Baseball and the Hall of Fame were not just going to allow their big parade to get rained on. And the Doubleday myth was pretty deeply established at that point. It was in history books, American history books, as fact that Doubleday invented baseball, not just in baseball history books. And certainly that's what I understood growing up in the 1950s. I think most people my generation also knew that. So there was just a lot of pushback. And I think in more contemporary times now, in the recent 25 years, there's just more of an opening to fact-based history as opposed to, anecdote and rumor-based history. That's all I can tell you.
Any other hands or questions before we kind of start to wrap it up? Because we have just about filled our entire time, which is always exciting for the book club. And I will say that I don't know how many of you are regular attendees, but it's been a while since we've had 50 plus folks on the call like we do tonight. So this was special and a really good time. I want to thank David for doing this. Any others before I kind of wrap it up? Okay, David, it's been wonderful. Can't tell you how much I speak on behalf of everyone when I say how truly exciting this was and how enjoyable it was. We look forward to to the new book and seeing it here very, very soon. And if anybody has any additional questions for David or chat questions for David, please feel free to put them in, or even email the co-chairs afterwards. We'll make sure that we circulate them, and so he can get back to you. David, I'll give you the last word.
Well, thank you. Thanks, John. I'm just very, very thankful for being invited to do this. It's fun for me. I don't do it very often, I have to acknowledge. I'm very kind of overwhelmed that so many people tuned into this, because it was, the SABR convention on July 4th and everything. I just didn't think that it would be as popular. So I appreciate the fact that so many people took time out to participate. And I welcome any questions, follow-up questions. People, I can give you my email address if you don't have it already. It's old_ball_game@hotmail.com. And I, welcome any comments or questions that people want to throw at me. There's this book and there's this book. They're both really good.
They are indeed. And we're lucky to have you, David. We appreciate it. Everyone kind of just keep your eyes on your emails. I know Bob had, I guess, something came up for him tonight. We lost Peter due to some technical issues. But in terms of next meetings, in terms of timing and topics, we'll get those out to you. David, again, thank you so very, very much. It was great seeing everyone this evening, and we'll be talking to you soon. Have a good night.
Thank you, John. Good night, everybody.
Good night, guys.